When immigrants traversed the American continent in the 1800s, countless thousands of people in search of a new life came through this area. We'll show you a site where a legacy of endurance, heartache, and tenacity will inspire millions for generations to come. Next on Ghost Towns and More. Prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, thousands of Americans from around the world traversed a sector of modern-day Wyoming and had to do it the hard way. Many people came by oxen team or horse-drawn wagons, and many of them walked. The Oregon, Mormon, and California immigrant trails converged through one famous area known as Martin's Cove. One of the great mass migrations of the American West were of the converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who came from the British Isles and other European countries to join with the main body of saints in the Utah Territory. Many immigrants wanted to come, but a lot of them could not afford to make the journey. Church leaders came up with an idea to make the journey less costly by using handcarts that sojourners could construct after their long ocean passage and river trips to Iowa. From there, they pulled and pushed handcarts the rest of the way across the vast plains, through the Continental Divide, and into the Utah Territory. The handcart program proved successful for the majority of those who set out this way, but in 1856, a delay in England set off a domino effect that would spell doom for a few select handcart companies headed to Utah. Converts in England had to make the journey to Utah by leaving no later than March in order to arrive in Utah before winter snow set in throughout the Rocky Mountains. Because of an unforeseen delay due to troubles with their departing ship, immigrants were forced to leave about 2 months late. Those at receiving stations assumed no other groups were coming as the travel season was drawing to a close. One can only imagine how shocked those at the stations along the route must have been to discover large travel companies arriving with about 1,100 people. The two largest parties, led by Captain James Willey and Captain Edward Martin, had intentions of trying to make it to Utah before winter set in. With nowhere to go or stay, these people faced a daunting decision. Nearly destitute of funds and resources, the people had a choice to risk the changing weather or try to find a way to survive through the winter where they were and resume travel in the spring. Church leaders and residents in Utah had no idea more people were coming as the autumn months began to turn colder. Leaders of the two immigrant companies were warned of the danger and awful risk they were taking, and some advised against it. But a last-minute decision to continue on would prove to be devastating for the travelers. The companies forged ahead, about 2 weeks apart from each other, but as they both approached the Wyoming Territory, fierce winter snows began to set in. Supplies were running low, and many had abandoned needed supplies to lighten their load. As the weather in the Rockies near the Continental Divide worsened, the parties became stranded. Hypothermia began claiming many lives, frostbite necessitated amputations, and starvation threatened the rest. There were some fast travelers passing the companies who went on to Salt Lake City and alerted church officials that two large immigrant parties were stranded in the snows and plains hundreds of miles away. An emergency call went out to assemble as many men as possible to form rescue parties. Wagons with desperately needed supplies headed out immediately to rescue the stranded travelers. Stories from survivors are legend. The Martin Company found shelter from the blizzards in a shallow cove near Devil's Gate in present-day Wyoming, where they hoped for rescue. One by one, people were starving and dying from the relentless weather. Jane Bryce was an 11-year-old member of the Martin Company and was traveling with her brother and parents, who were all from England. She later recalled the horrid conditions.
One night it snowed about a foot, and the next morning, when the company again moved on, our progress was even more slow and difficult than before. During the first snowstorm, my mother became sick, and though she lingered for weeks, she grew worse each day. When she died, they wrapped her in a quilt and buried her in the deep snow. There were 3 crossings of the Sweetwater River, and it was at the middle crossing where my mother was buried.
As the saints continued on, things only worsened. Jane described the awful circumstance they faced.
Our progress became so slow that we sometimes traveled only a half a mile a day. One night, it thundered and lightened so terribly that we were forced to camp and go to bed without anything to eat. It was now November, and so cold that nearly everyone had frozen feet. One man had both feet frozen so badly that he had to have them amputated. When I took my shoes off one night after a very cold day's travel, my feet were black with blisters. My feet were so terribly swollen that I could not wear my shoes, so I had to wrap them in old rags and sacks in order to walk at all.
Before her mother Hannah died, her last words to her daughter were that where they were going was the right place and where they should stay. These were words to a young girl that would give her the resolve to remain faithful to the cause of where they were going. When rescuers reached the Willie Company and later the Martin Company, words could not describe the suffering they witnessed. The stranded victims felt merciful relief to receive food, assistance, and especially to be able to ride in wagons toward Utah. Rescuers faced further daunting challenges in bringing the suffering survivors the rest of the way where they would receive care. Historians estimate that about 67 deaths claimed the lives of those in the Willie Company and an estimated 135 to 150 deaths in the Martin Company. By far the worst civilian disaster on the immigrant trails. The young survivor Jane Bryce went on to live and marry in Utah, raising her family in the small town of Colville. She has been revered by her countless descendants today. When she passed away in 1924, her body was laid to rest next to her husband in the Colville Cemetery as a celebrated pioneer who survived the Martin handcart ordeal and lived an honorable life. Along this immigrant trail just west of Martin's Cove is the highest point on the Continental Divide through the place called South Pass, where water on one side runs east and water on the other side runs west on the American continent. Today, a stone marker identifies the place where the uphill journey begins its downhill trend toward the west. Along this arduous trail, many thousands more came. Many died along the trail, such that it was reported that there were graves every several feet.
One thing people don't realize is that during that time frame, like 350 wagons a day were passing through on those trails.
Just 6 years after Jane Bryce arrived in Utah, the family of Robert Danzy came through with their wagon company. His young wife Charlotte was pregnant when she went into labor one fateful evening.
Now, Charlotte was pregnant at the time, and they had a difficult decision to make. It was late in the year. Do we stay here and wait till the baby's born, or do we travel with the saints and risk going to Salt Lake in the cold weather? And so they decided that because of the mobs and the hostility, that it was probably safer for the family to go ahead and go with the saints.
On Saturday night of September 20th, 1862, Charlotte delivered a baby boy, and she and her husband named him Joseph. The baby passed away, and Charlotte's health had deteriorated to the point she could endure no longer.
After the baby was born, Charlotte was in an extreme amount of pain, was cold, exhausted, and she asked Robert for a priesthood blessing, and she asked him to release her in that blessing because she was done. She was at the end of her strength and could go no further. So Robert laid his hands on her, gave her a priesthood blessing, and released her from this life. Shortly after she passed away.
Robert, having lost his young wife and infant son, was left with 5 young children. The wagon company had to press on and found a place to dig a grave. Near Pacific Springs in present-day Wyoming, men located a suitable place and began digging. No sooner had they started when others came riding up and notified them that another young woman, Caroline Myers, had also passed away at the tender age of 25. The men made the grave wider to accommodate all 3 bodies. The crude circumstances for burial were all that Robert could bear.
They had nothing to bury Charlotte in. They put her in her best dress. They put a blue beaded necklace on her. They wrapped the baby and placed the baby with her in the grave along with the Myers lady. And because they didn't have a coffin, Robert took the chest that they had, the lid off of the chest, which had the hasp of a British lion on it, and placed it over her head, and then buried her. And the only marking that they had was a stone. They just put a big stone on the area. And if you can imagine, a stone in the prairie is the only marker.
With the children sobbing, Robert turned and continued on the trail toward the Utah Territory. Robert later remarried and lived out his life in Harriman, Utah. Years later, his descendants became interested in locating the place where Charlotte was buried.
The grandkids, hearing the story, wanted to go find Charlotte's grave. They wanted to go see it. They wanted to put a marker on it. So in the 1930s, they went out, 2 of them, and looked all over. And like I said, I don't know how you find a rock in the prairie and with all the sagebrush and stuff and think, okay, I found the grave. But there happened to be a Mexican sheep herder out there, and so they approached him. He was grazing his sheep in that area and asked, because it was right along the trail, if he knew of any pioneer graves that were along the area. And he says, oh, I know where one is. And he says, but it's been robbed. And they took him to a site that had been spot that had been dug up, and there were some bones and things, and the Mexican sheep herder reached into his pocket and he pulled out a handful of blue beads. He was the one that had robbed the grave. But if they had not shown up right then, if he had not dug up the grave and found the beads, they never would have found her grave.
The family descendants were able to petition the U.S. government to dedicate the burial site of Charlotte Danzy, her infant son Joseph, and Caroline Myers.
The Congress passed legislation giving an acre of ground to the family. To be able to own the site where she lays. And it's a joy to go see and realize the sacrifice that our ancestors made.
Today, the burial site of Charlotte is a sacred place of peace and honor to treasured ancestors of the past. There is a visitor center at Martins Cove, Wyoming, where visitors can come and gain an appreciation for the price paid by colonizers who dare to start out on an adventure with unknown futures. There are numerous displays, and tour guides are on hand to answer questions and provide a memorable experience for everyone. Each year, church youth groups come to Martins Cove to experience overland trail reenactments with handcarts and multi-day camps along the historic trail so as to get a feel for what their ancestors and other pioneers were facing in the histories we now treasure. The Martins Cove story is a powerful historical drama that is representative of the sacrifices that so many people made who came in search of a better life, a better future, and greater opportunities.